This is MichMash, a weekly conversation where we try to unjumble an important and sometimes under-the-radar statewide story that affects you. I'm Cheyna Roth.
And I'm Gorchow. I believe when we last spoke about the U.S. Senate race, things were pretty tame. State Senator Mallory McMorrow had thrown her hat in the ring, but now, well, this race has gotten pretty interesting, hasn't it, Cheyna? What's the latest?
Very interesting. A lot of familiar names have announced that they want a shot at their party's nomination. Does Abdul El Sayed ring any bells?
That's the doctor from Detroit who ran against Gretchen Whitmer for the Democratic nomination for governor back in 2018. I am familiar.
Okay, what about Haley Stevens?
That's an easy one. The current U.S. representative for Michigan's 11th congressional district in southern Oakland County since 2019.
Okay, those are the latest Democrats to enter the race. But what about the Republicans? Are you familiar with Mike Rogers?
Oh, yes. He lost the closest race for U.S. Senate in Michigan history last year to Alyssa Slotkin. Now he's back for another try, the former state senator and congressman, betting that having all the campaign infrastructure and statewide name ID from his race last year will put him in the pole position for the Republican nomination. And it feels like we can't go a week without some type of candidate announcement, doesn't it?
It really does. I feel like we could have every episode of MichMash be about the latest person to enter a race in Michigan. And that's especially when you consider the ongoing announcements for the governor's race as well. But for today, let's focus on the U.S. Senate races. And let's start with the Democrats, because as we have mentioned, they are more known candidates there, and there's more candidates in general there. Is this likely it for who's going to come into the race, or could others still get in?
Well, I think there's two more possibilities for the Democrats. The most likely to add his name to the mix is State Representative Joe Tate from Detroit. He was Speaker of the House in 2023 and 2024. He's been traveling the state to places way away from Detroit, like Aranac County, for example, and made clear he's interested. Now, 2024 ended in disaster for Tate's House. Listeners, if you need a refresh, go back and listen to the last couple of MichMash episodes from that year. But Tate does have a good resume. He's a military veteran, played football at Michigan State, and he does have the Democratic successes of 2023 to campaign on. Plus, he'd potentially be the first Democratic nominee for U.S. Senate in Michigan who's Black. So there is a potential lane for him for the Democratic nomination if he jumps in.
The other is Attorney General Dana Nessel, who obviously has statewide name recognition and the ability to stay in the news by fighting the Trump administration. So she has more time to decide if she's going to get into the race or not. But let's talk about the three in the race right now. They each have their own lanes. Stevens is kind of your classic Gretchen Whitmer, Debbie Dingell, Gary Peters Democrat, a combination of business and labor support, more of an establishment type figure who has emphasized her work on the 2009 auto rescue for the Obama administration.
And El Sayed, as folks I think know, is the voice of the progressive left in Michigan. Think like Rashida Tlaib, for example. Bernie Sanders endorsed him in 2018 for governor, and no surprise, he's already endorsed him for U.S. Senate this time around. El Sayed's number one priority is Medicare for all, another big progressive left cause. He and Stevens are going to be at polar ends of this debate in Democratic politics, also about the role of corporations and whether government support to woo them to the state is good policy.
And then you have McMorrow, and she's kind of in the middle of that debate and has described herself as a pragmatist. She's a really interesting candidate to me. She's supported aid to attract businesses to Michigan in the past, but made it clear in 2024 she would no longer support that as the state's only policy on business attraction.
You know, Cheyna, all three should be able to raise a lot of money based on their past performance. But one factor to watch is what the PAC affiliated with the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, which spent millions to help Stevens in her 2022 Democratic congressional primary against Andy Levin. What do they do this time? AIPAC's PAC, that's a mouthful, contributed heavily to her U.S. House committee in the first quarter of this year. And Stevens is known as the most resolutely pro-Israel candidate. McMorrow is trying to thread this difficult needle in Democratic politics on the issue. El Sayed, who would be the first practicing Muslim elected to the U.S. Senate, is a strong critic of Israel and its counteroffensive in Gaza.
In some ways, this primary feels likely to be driven by personality more than policy. Things like McMorrow calling for the replacement of Senator Chuck Schumer as the Democratic leader, and Stevens saying Schumer is doing a great job. In other words, which of these candidates, all of whom have loyal followings, they all kind of have their little groups or cliques in Michigan Democratic politics, which one of them is going to touch voters' emotional pull the best?
That's right. I mean, think about it. The last three times Democrats did not have the incumbent senator, 2000 with Debbie Stabenow, 2014 with Gary Peters, and 2024 with Alyssa Slotkin, the field was essentially cleared for them. This, believe it or not, is going to be the first legit Democratic primary for U.S. Senate in Michigan since 1994. And it's going to be a tough one for Democratic voters because, as parties say of primaries, this is a race among friends. And those can sometimes produce the most bitter feelings.
On Rogers, who's sort of on an island right now, how likely is a strong Republican challenger to him in the GOP primary?
That's a great question, Cheyna. I mean, right now, there are a handful of names kicking the tires. The most notable is Congressman Bill Huizenga. He's the longtime U.S. House member from the west side of the state, like Zeeland, Holland, Kalamazoo, those kinds of places. He's taking a serious look. He'd need to convince donors in his home base of West Michigan that Rogers, who's pretty similar in ideology and politics to him, that Rogers had his chance in 2024 and lost. We've also talked about State Senator Jonathan Lindsay of Coldwater. He's still looking more of a MAGA type, Trump type candidate. The Detroit News also reported that Lorenzo Sewell, a Detroit pastor who spoke at President Trump's inauguration, is considering a run. He'd be an interesting candidate. And then there's also 2022 gubernatorial candidates Tudor Dixon and Kevin Rinke, though either or both may run for governor, not U.S. Senate.
Which is sort of the interesting, I don't know, Sophie's choice that a lot of these candidates are facing in the upcoming months and year is, do you run for governor or do you run for U.S. Senate? I mean, it seems like there are quite a number of candidates that are doing that sort of balancing and trying to decide between the two offices.
I think the Dixon choice is really interesting. I mean, right now you look and you say, well, maybe a head-to-head race against Mike Rogers looks pretty good compared to what is a more crowded governor's race with John James, Eric Nesbitt, Mike Cox, and maybe others. But, Dixon was the nominee in 2022, and that might be what she really wants, like either governor or nothing. The U.S. Senate just doesn't have the same drive. We're going to find out.
All right, we're going to take a quick break here, but when we come back, we're going to be joined by Dr. Brittany Taylor of the Keep Michigan Kids Tobacco-Free Alliance. Stick with us.
Welcome back. I'm Zach Gorchow. Joining us now is Dr. Brittany Taylor of the Keep Michigan Kids Tobacco-Free Alliance. She practices medicine at Hurley Medical Center in Flint in internal medicine and pediatrics. Dr. Taylor, welcome to MichMash.
So glad to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So, Dr. Taylor, let's start with a big picture question. How is Michigan doing when it comes to preventing those under the age of 21 from using tobacco and nicotine products?
Unfortunately, Michigan is quite behind the rest of the nation when it comes to tobacco use, particularly when it comes to youth. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that youth are actually able to get a hold of these tobacco products much easier than they are in other states and other regions of the world. A lot of that has to do with the fact that we don't actually license our retailers, unlike alcohol and cannabis and a lot of other products that you would think, including Christmas trees and dogs. You don't have to have a license in order to sell tobacco products. And because of this, there's really there's no stick when it comes to retailers kind of being held accountable and not selling to individuals they're not supposed to, aka individuals under the age of 21. It's all carrot. It's all just hoping that they're doing what they're supposed to. And unfortunately, we know that we have very high non-compliance rates with this, upwards of 60% in certain areas, but kind of a state average of around 30%, where if a minor goes in and tries to buy a tobacco product, they're able to buy it. And so because of this ease of getting the products, it's one of the big things that's driving it, unfortunately, in Michigan.
What are the main tobacco and nicotine products that people under 21 are using these days? I feel like anecdotally, cigarettes aren't really the main thing anymore.
Yeah. So you hit the nail on the head with that. So I think a lot of times the cigarettes are not the cool thing anymore for youth. They're actually the fourth most used product, and I think it's around based on the most recent monitoring the future survey, which is put out by the University of Michigan as of 2024. I think it's around 2 to 3% are using cigarettes, and the vast majority, around 15 to 16%, are using e-cigarettes or vapes. They're the same thing. A lot of people kind of use that word interchangeably, and then that's followed by hookah and cigars or cigarellos. So those like Swisher Sweets and different small little cigars, and then cigarettes. So much, much lower down on the use rates when it comes to use. So individuals under the age of 21 and even 18. So that's really the big thing that's driving it. The majority, again, of the, around 20% of youth who are using in Michigan, 15 to 16% are using e-cigarettes, if not e-cigarettes plus another tobacco product.
Vaping use has trended down nationally a little in the wake of the Food and Drug Administration cracking down on flavored e-cigarettes. But how are people under 21 getting cigarettes in Michigan, whether it's the traditional kind you smoke or the electric kind?
So again, most of them just go and buy it at the store, unfortunately, which is just not the case in a lot of other states. And again, we know this from the Monitoring the Future survey, that same survey that I was just talking about, that that kind of looks at what youth are doing in terms of risky behaviors. And so a lot of them are either getting it from friends, from family, from a peer, or getting it from the store directly. Very few are getting it from online. I feel like that's a huge thing that everyone's like, oh, they're buying it online or et cetera, et cetera. And that's only like a very, very small percentage, like less than 10% are actually getting it online. So most of them are just either getting it from a friend who bought it from a store, an older individual who bought it from a store and gave it to them, or they're just going and buying it themselves. So there's not a whole lot of difficulty for them to get a hold of the product. Again, I'm going to keep talking about this survey because it's very good data around Michigan, but they actually asked youth, hey, if you went into a store and tried to buy cigarettes or an e-cigarette, how often have you been declined because of your age? AKA, did they say, no, you can't buy it because it's illegal for you to buy as you're under the age of 21? And almost 98% of the kids were like, yeah, that never happened to me. If I go and buy a product, it didn't happen. And that was like, it's been a pretty steady rate. And when they ask about cigarettes, it's a little bit lower, 95%. So it's funny that there's a difference in those two. But again, there's like the youth know that they're probably not going to get turned away, and so there's not a lot of concern about them going in and having to buying a product.
I'm curious. So vaping, as we've established, is starting to trend downward. And, there wasn't always vaping. It started as a trend and it went up and around. But what is the next big concern in tobacco? Is there a new way of getting the nicotine that you are all keeping an eye on right now?
I think the other one that's coming up, and I think from the way, again, that we're doing a lot of surveying, it's not capturing it very well. And sometimes it takes a couple of years for these trends to really be captured. It's nicotine pouches. So I think the one that's almost synonymous with what a nicotine pouch is Zyn. And so there are these products that don't contain tobacco. They just contain nicotine. So that's the active ingredient in tobacco. And you put it underneath the lip. And so I mean, there's been so many memes about it now. So I feel like it's very much in the ether right now. As of the last national survey, it's around 2% of youth are using it. And so I'm expecting from this next survey, that it's probably going to increase. I think the biggest issue with the way that we do the surveying is that most people don't think of them as nicotine pouches. They just think Zyn. So they don't always relate the two together. So it might actually be the way that we're surveying is not capturing it. And I also want to say that e-cigarettes, while they have declined from their huge peak in 2018 and 2019, they've kind of leveled off in terms of youth usage. We're kind of been around 14, 15, 16% for the last couple years. Again, with the COVID pandemic, we saw a dip. If kids are at home all the time with their family, it makes it a little bit more difficult to use the products. And so there was a little bit of a dip there. And now we've kind of recovered in a sense where the percentages have been steady around, 14, 15, 16%. So I think that's where it's probably going to be leveling off until we make some other changes.
One thing you mentioned is that people under 21 are going into these stores and buying these products, but it's illegal. Like, why is that happening? Why is that happening?
Well, so I never want to demonize because our retailers, because I'm sure that the vast majority of our retailers are abiding by the law. They're not selling to minors, and they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. But it only takes one bad store that all the kids know, oh, this store is going to be selling, and because we don't really have a way to kind of monitor this, and there really isn't a big penalty for selling to minors. There really is no reason to not. I mean, you're selling a product, you're making a sale, and you're getting really loyal customers that are going to keep coming back. And so it's not there's a really not a lot of reason not to sell to youth if you are currently, and that's a big issue. So there is no mechanism for them to really lose their license, so they can continue to sell these products again and again and again. There's not really a big penalty with this as well. So again, there's really no stick. It's all carrot. We're just really hoping that they're not doing it, because that's the right thing to do, because that's the law. But I think we know from many things that just because something is the law doesn't mean if there's no teeth behind this, it doesn't really make a big change. It doesn't make the retailers want to abide by that. And so again, I'm sure that the vast majority of retailers are doing what they're supposed to be doing. But again, only takes one or two bad stores to make it easy for youth to get a hold of them, these products.
So your organization, which just to remind our listeners is the Keep Michigan Kids Tobacco Free Alliance, pushed really hard in 2024 for legislation that would have required retailers to obtain a license for selling nicotine or tobacco products. And it would have established much stronger fines for retailers who do sell those products to people under 21. But this got caught up in the lame duck collapse at the end of Democratic control in 2024 and never got to the governor's desk. So what is the rationale behind this legislation overall?
So kind of as I was speaking about, that this creates the licensure structure for retailers. So if there's a way to hold them accountable if they are caught selling to underage youth or selling products that they're not supposed to. So we know that there's a lot of products that are currently banned by the FDA. They're not supposed to be being sold on the shelves. So not only is it protecting our youth, but our adults. And so it's a way that, if you get caught doing this, there's a fine. There's some sort of penalty associated with it. And if it happens enough times, you're not going to be able to sell these products anymore. You're not going to be able to sell tobacco products. And so that's a lot of what the structure, what this bill, and hopefully will be reintroduced, does. And so we worked really hard last year with the retailers themselves to make sure that that was something palatable for them. We don't want the license fee to be so high that we're going to put our small businesses out of business. And we also wanted to make sure that it was realistic. Now, a clerk is a pretty low wage job, and so there's a lot of turnover. And so this was something we talked about a lot about with a lot of our businesses, to make sure that we didn't want to put undue penalties on a clerk who again, we talking a lot about equity and issues with that, but we also wanted to make sure that they had some skin in the game, but made sure it was balanced with the ownership of the store itself. And also making sure that the look back period for that also reflected kind of the reality of employment and different things like that. All things, I'm a physician. I know a lot about like how to help with tobacco treatment and different things like that and the health effects of it, but I don't always know how to run a gas station. So this is what is super important for us to be reflective and make sure that could be helpful.
So these bills passed the Senate with all Democrats in support and all Republicans in opposition, which seems ominous as far as trying to win support from the now Republican-controlled House. Are you going to keep trying this legislative session to get this moving?
We're hoping that this is going to be bipartisan this year. So there's been a lot of outreach to Republican members. So I know that we have one Republican sponsor lined up. Until it's on there, I can't say who, but we do have someone who's hoping to. And again, I think when we're talking with Republicans, they're very pro-family, pro-kid, pro-life, and doing this is is this, it runs along the same kind of value system with us. We're trying to protect youth from a lifetime of addiction from tobacco products, and we're just trying to make sure that people are obeying the law that we have. And this is a federal law too, so we're just so a lot of times it might be speaking a little bit differently to the Republicans, but a lot of them can resonate with that. With the messaging that we're going on around tobacco products, and making sure again that we've been exceptionally mindful, like I was talking about striking that balance between businesses and public health. And I think I'm hopeful that we're going to be seeing this legislation introduced in the next couple weeks. We're hoping for maybe next week, and it's going to be bipartisan. So again, fingers crossed. I think last year with the lame duck madness, a lot of bills got taken down with it, and there was a lot of partisanship in that. So as a non political figure or someone non-lobbyist, that was my general impression.
So as you know, the retailers oppose this legislation. They've called it a money grab, said the industry is already providing the state with hundreds of millions in tax dollars that could go toward tobacco cessation. What do you say to that? And will the new legislation you just referred to that is on the way be any different from what was worked on last year?
Yeah, so we've made some changes. So I will say that the Michigan Chamber of Commerce, I believe, now I'm forgetting who it was. There was someone that we got to neutral, which was a big deal. But the gas stations and the some of the other small businesses still were in opposition. But a lot of times we had softened a lot of the language, and we've still been having a lot of discussions with that around this. And again, I would listen, the tobacco, our tobacco section at MDHHS is one of the least funded in the United States. I think we're 44th for funding, and we just barely squeaked up from 50th last year after a small increase in the funding last year. And so that we don't have a ton of funding to do this work. And it's different to have cessation supports. That's one part, one super, super important part. But we also have to stop individuals from getting a hold of these products as well. Again, e-cigarettes and tobacco products are addictive. They are harmful. Tobacco is the leading cause of preventable death in the United States and in Michigan. It is not a benign substance that we're selling. So this is not like candy or soda or different things like that where you're like, probably shouldn't have a ton of that. But I mean, we know this is really, really bad for you. And so a lot of times I'm like, this is the hill that we want to die on. This product is the one that we're going to get really upset about. And again, I always want to emphasize that these bills, we have gone through so many iterations to make this as business friendly as possible without like making sure that we have enough funding to actually do the checks and actually do, put the infrastructure in place. The money that we get from the tobacco taxes right now goes a lot to the general fund. So it pays for a variety of different services. And a lot of it goes to, again, it goes into the general fund. So that could be paying for the mail service or funding the roads or schools or different things like that. So again, I would love it when we do our appropriations process that we, earmark that funding back to cessation in this program. But that's a whole other can of worms. So especially with everything going on at the federal level, I'm not optimistic that that is going to be a legitimate way forward. I also say that we are an outlier. We're one of only 8 states that doesn't license tobacco retailers. So it's not as though this is something that's just outlandish that only two or three states do. And most of the fee that we have right now in the bill as it stands is on the medium side. So it's not as though we're just like picking this number out of a hat. So fingers crossed about this legislation. And again, we have been happy to come to the table and discuss with businesses about this and try and make it as palatable as possible for them.
One component of the legislation that your organization supports is to repeal the misdemeanor penalty for those under 21 purchasing, using, and possessing tobacco, and the slightly lesser penalties for possessing vapor or other similar nicotine products. This seems counterintuitive. Can you explain why that's a good idea?
So we know that these penalties, which you call pup penalties, they're not effective deterrents for youth. That is just not the way that their brain works. We know from the war on drugs that it's not super helpful to criminalize an addiction. It doesn't really solve a lot in terms of that. And so some of these penalties are pretty steep. I mean, it can be up to a misdemeanor for certain tobacco products, which is just, and they take them to drug court. So not really something I really want our youth doing. I'm not saying that we shouldn't penalize them at all. We should just, hug them and be like, oh, great. But it's not right now it's the only thing for a lot of counties and a lot of areas. This is all you get. You get caught with a product, you get slapped with a fine. Good luck. Try not to use the product anymore, instead of connecting them with cessation services or getting them into counseling and different things like that. As a former tobacco user, and I didn't quit until I was 2 years into being a doctor, I know how difficult it is to quit. It's not something that's that easy. And so a $50 fine probably wouldn't have changed my mind at 16, and it's shown not to change the mind of youth, and it's not a very effective deterrent. And again, it kind of goes hand in hand with tobacco retail licensure, because we really want to hold the adults in the situation accountable, aka the retailers, rather than the children. So that's kind of how those two bills work together, if that makes sense.
Does. Well, Dr. Taylor, thank you so much for joining us on MichMash today.
And thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being able to talk about this really important topic.